So during the past few weeks, I've been working on various projects and making a bunch of small games in order to improve at making games in Unity, and also just for fun. However, these games aren't exactly bringing home the bread, so in the last couple of days I've actually been working on a brand new game that I'm actually planning to finish and publish. So let's talk about that. First of all, what is this game? Well, as you can probably tell, it's an FPS or a first-person shooter, not to be confused with frames per second or finally, pizza sauce. Now you may ask, why would I decide to make a first-person shooter? Surely I could have gone with something a little more innovative and exciting. Well, I have two reasons. One, they're relatively easy to make. You basically just need to make some hands and a gun, slap on a camera, and bing bang boom video game. In other words, the fact that the game is in first person means that there are a lot less animations and modeling needed since the player can't see themselves. And as you can probably tell, if I'm gonna make a game, it's gonna have to be easy to animate. And reason B is that, well, I just like first person shooters. So then what's the game gonna be about? Well, I actually don't know, I was just gonna kinda wing it and make it up as I go. But I have decided on a general idea of what it's going to be like. Basically, it's going to be a futuristic fast-paced shooter with a lot of movement, kinda like Doom. And currently, I think I've got that part down pretty well. The player moves really quickly and the acceleration and deceleration is very snappy, and everything just feels really smooth but still in control. This is all done through a custom rigid body based player controller which allows for the player to be affected by the physics system while still giving me a lot of control over the movement, which is pretty nice. But just having standard FPS game movement didn't really feel fun enough, so I also added wall running, which was inspired by Titanfall 2. And I think I did a pretty decent job of blatantly ripping it off. I did a ton of fine tuning and was able to get the wall running to feel really nice and in control, which allows you to do some pretty cool things quite easily. Basically, it works by first doing some spooky math with normals to detect when the player hit the vertical surface and start the wall run. Due to how this works, I was able to allow the wall run to start regardless of the direction the player is facing, which allowed for some cool moves like Mario style wall jumps and pulling yourself up ledges. Anyways, after it detects a wall, it does a couple checks to ensure that the player can only wall run on each surface once before touching another surface, so you can't do wacky things like this. Then it starts the wall run and regulates the player's vertical speed so they don't go too high or just fall off, and applies some force to stick the player to the wall while also giving the player a small speed boost, just like in Titanfall, while applying some visual effects like tilting the camera and increasing the field of view. Then, when the player moves with enough force away from the wall, touches the ground, stops moving, or jumps, the wall run stops. And honestly, I'm very happy with how all this turned out. The addition of wall running opens up a lot of interesting level design choices and also just looks very cool. So that's the first person aspect of the first person shooter. But what about the shootering? Well, I'm glad you asked. But first, a little background on how shooting works in video games. When it comes to first person shooters, traditionally games will use something called hit scan to simulate bullets. Basically, every time you pull the trigger in a game that uses hit scan, the game will do something like a recast, which uses a bunch of fancy maths to calculate where you're pointing at and hit that thing with a bullet. This is very computationally efficient and is relatively easy to implement, but it's also very limited as the bullets hit instantly, so you can't really add things like realistic bullet physics. So a common alternative is to actually simulate the bullets, which is a bit more demanding on the computer, but lets you make the bullet do pretty much whatever you want. And that's the approach I took because I think the trade-off is worth it and it also looks a bit better, especially if I want to add things like slow motion later on. So I implemented physics-based bullets, added a script to shoot them out of the guns, and wrote some code to handle hitting things. Then for the finishing touches I added some animations, an ammo counter, and reloading. And yeah, those are the game mechanics I've implemented so far. However, you can't make a game using only mechanics, which brings me to my next point, graphics. And yes, my game does in fact have graphics. To be more specific, it uses a standard Unity graphics engine along with a post-processing stack for things like bloom and ambient occlusion, which renders the models which are all made and animated in Blender by me. I've also sprinkled in some small visual effects like particle effects here and there for things like bullets hitting things. And last of all, I threw in a bit of Perlin noise, which is a type of smooth randomness to shake the camera during shooting for some extra oomph, and also to make the arm swing around. And yeah, it looks pretty good. There's not much else to say. So we have a player, we have game mechanics, and we have fancy graphics. But what good is all that without actual gameplay? So I also added enemies, or really just one enemy, although I will be adding more later on. So let's talk about that. If you've watched any of my previous videos, you've probably realized that I really like physics and that pretty much every Unity game I've made so far has featured something floppy, and I don't plan on stopping anytime soon. And that's why all the enemies in this game are all physics based and procedurally animated through code. Basically, they're physics objects being pushed up by legs that are animated using some code and inverse kinematics, which is a way to bend and move legs in a convincing manner. And with the way I implemented it, this is all extremely flexible and I can do all sorts of cool things like blow off the limbs. Oh yeah, it also means that I don't have to actually make any animations myself, which is a definite plus. Adding this system into the game was actually pretty straightforward, as I had already written most of the code for a previous project, and I pretty much just had to port it over, make a few adjustments, and apply it to my brand new enemy model. Then I wrote a bit of code to control the enemies and make them walk where I wanted them to, slapped on a gun, made the gun work, realized that the gun did not in fact work, spent a couple hours attempting to fix bugs, cried for a few hours, spent more hours fixing bugs, gave up, scrapped half the code and rewrote it, and yeah, it works pretty damn well. Basically, the enemy behaves by first pathfinding to a certain distance away from the player. It does this using a Unity nav mesh agent that's set to only give me the pass to the player, so I can handle all the movement myself through the physics-enabled rigid body. Then, once it's a certain distance away from the player, it'll start aiming and shooting. The body rotates towards the player on the Y-axis in Unity or Z if you're using Blender, while this turret thing rotates to face up and down. Then it'll just keep following the player and shooting and backing away if the player gets too close. One thing to note is that the enemy is extremely accurate, however the bullets from the enemies are a lot slower than the player's bullets. This means that the only way to avoid getting shot is to move around a lot, which forces the player to use all the movement mechanics I implemented earlier, which is good. But then, how do you defeat this enemy? Well, by shooting it, of course. What else are you gonna do? Come to a peaceful solution through non-violent means that doesn't involve murdering your opponent's entire family? Pfft, don't be ridiculous. Anyways, where was I? Oh right, shooting things. As of now, the enemy has a total of 10 health, and shooting the body will decrease the health by 1, while shooting the legs will decrease the health by 2, although that will change once I add different weapons that do different amounts of damage. Also, if you hit one of the legs, it'll be crippled and separated from the body. Once the leg is destroyed, the enemy will no longer be able to control where it's going and instead will just attempt to shoot you by spinning in place. Once 2 legs are destroyed, it'll no longer be able to aim and it will kinda just flail around. And when all the legs are gone, it'll just flop on the ground. However, if at any point the enemy's health reaches 0, it'll just die and explode, which is achieved using a particle system and a script. And honestly, I'm quite happy with this. It works really well and is easily scalable, since almost everything is done through code. So if I, for example, want to add a version of the enemy that has, say, 8 legs, I just have to make a new enemy model with 8 legs and copy the scripts over. And yeah, that's my game so far. In my opinion, it's looking pretty good and it's quite fun to play. But you don't have to take my word for it, because you can play a demo of the game for yourself. Just download it at the link in the description. And of course, any suggestions, recommendations, or bug reports are welcome. And also, as of recording this video, I've only been working on the game for around 5 or 6 days, albeit for like 8 hours a day because I have nothing better to do. But that means that if nothing gets in the way, at the rate I'm going, it'll hopefully be finished in a few months. So hit like and subscribe if you want to see that, and stay tuned to future devlogs and dumb shenanigans, and yeah. Thanks for watching, I'm out.